the mood. Because see, Prague went through many years, and we are trying to focus starting on the 16th and 17th century. So we have to transport ourselves back, because to experience the city, the nice part of spending in Prague is not just to see sights, because to see sights, you could go on your website on prague.cz and just watch the sights. The idea is to experience it. So the important thing is to go back to how it was in the 16th century, where we are starting. And the idea is to have a view and an idea of what the 16th century. Now, Prague and the Czech community was way before the 16th century, right? We know that the show that we're going to see tonight is there from the 14th century. So now, why do we start at the 16th century? Does anybody have a clue? What's special about the 16th century that Prague, we are focusing starting at that point in time? First of all, the rabbinic authority, the Maharal had a very strong impact both in the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community. So on the Jewish side, in the Jewish arena, very interesting times. But not only that, in Prague, in the Bohemian, this is the time of Rudolf II. Rudolf II, as I told a lot of people, he's called the mystic king. He's the one who is the Holy Roman Emperor that was sitting in Bohemia, Moravia, in the city of Prague. And he was we're going to soon see what's called a mystical king. And the number 3 is the beginning of modern science. This is the cradle of modern science. We spoke about it. What makes it modern science versus ancient science? Anybody? Huh? The first thing is the challenge to the status quo. Yes, and so the question, how you define it. See, the world calls it, there is such a thing called the science revolution that started. If you go to any school, they'll tell you the science revolution, and starts when? It starts with Copernicus, and it ends with Isaac Newton, right? This is the time, if you go to any school, go to Columbia, go to Harvard, you're going to go have in the school of the science revolution, the early modern science revolution, which the beginning of modern science is from Copernicus to Newton in the 15th century to the 16th century. This is the time. Now, we spoke yesterday. Why is Copernicus so important? Why is that the beginning, and what's the contribution of Copernicus?
That the Earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around.
Exactly right, because this was the ingrained belief of Ptolemy. Does anybody know who Ptolemy was? Ptolemy wrote a book called the Almagest. The Almagest was written in the beginning, around the 3rd century, and it was an astronomy book. It's based on the astronomy of Aristotle. Because you realize something interesting. Beforehand, before modern science, you realize that science was part of philosophy. What's called natural philosophy. Does anybody know why it's called natural? Why was science part of philosophy? Did anybody take sciences in school? Right? In college, is it part of the humanities? It's not part of humanities. Why not? How did it shift from philosophy out of philosophy?
When you're able to prove it.
Huh?
When you're able to prove it, it becomes science.
Absolutely. It's excellent. It's testable. The idea of testing was not that you said that you... Now, why didn't people test beforehand? Why wasn't that? Because this is the modern science. Modern science is based on observation that you see with your own eyes. You just don't ponder and see it and pontificate. You actually see it, and you actually prove it, and you actually test it. This is the big revolution, because people didn't do that before. Before you went, and if anybody knows, was such a thing called the trivium and the quadrivium, meaning what was accepted teaching in a school, and was all based on philosophy, and was based on thinking, not on doing, not on thinking. This is the beginning of modern science that people start testing, and people start checking it. And you'll see that that's one of the characteristics of the modern science, that we start checking it. So Ptolemy wrote in the 3rd century, because he did see that if the world... Now, why did people believe? Why it was so basic and was so fundamental to believe that the world was geocentric, that it revolved around the Earth? Why it's so ingrained on people that... Why is the first thing that you thought? Meaning, why didn't they say the opposite? Meaning, how did they come up with this great idea?
It's ego. It's
Number one, ego. Great. Number two,
Did they see the sun moving?
right? Observable. Meaning if a person wakes up in the morning, he sees the sun comes out, the sun comes down, well, he's static. We don't move, we don't shake. That's number two. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it's observable and is also fits the ego. And there's number three also. Anybody?
Religion is pushing that as well.
Absolutely. Scriptures, if you read scripture on its own, it clearly says and repeats again and again and again this concept that the earth is static and the sun comes and rises and goes, and so it's observable. Number one, religion said the scriptures. If you take scripture on face value, that's what it says. And number three, it fits the human psyche because it all revolves around the man. Great, and that was it. Now, what was the problem with it? Does anybody know? Why did the Almagest get written? So this is Aristotelian. You don't need astronomy for this, meaning anybody, like if you wake up in the morning, that's what you think. So why was the Almagest written? You know why? Because if you're very careful observing the planets as the planets move, because you could see the planets, you write there are 5 planets that you can see with your naked eye. Now, why naked eye? Who invented the telescope? Very important to know. We are talking about, is this, in the 16th century, is that before or after the telescope? Before. Telescope is, who invented the telescope? Galileo in the 17th century. So this is before. So only this planet that you could see with the naked eye. Now, what is interesting about the naked eye? That the planets do not follow. If you trace the planets carefully, the planets show you that the geocentric idea is BS. It doesn't work. So Ptolemy wrote something called the Almagest, and the Almagest becomes the Ptolemean system, showing how is it possible, if the world is geocentric, that the planets are so erratic. And he created a formula and he created the Almagest. And the Almagest is this great work by Ptolemy explaining how it works. So this was fine, but it was very, 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 and I'll say very again, what you call unclear, and it was a forced interpretation. It was very not elegant, the model of Ptolemy, because in the world, you're trying to fit in a round square, in a round peg in a square hole, or a square peg in a round hole. Whatever you say, doesn't work. So this was, but the world was very fat and happy until a guy comes, and his name is Nicholas Copernicus. He was from Prussia, from Poland, and etc., then from the German Empire. And he goes ahead and says, perhaps it's a lot more elegant to say the opposite, to flip it on its head. So in the beginning, people thought that that was it. So, okay, so it's not the geocentric. It's only a formula because Almagest was only formulas to make things work. So they still believe the world was geocentric. So, but this is going to create a revolution because first of all, it changes everything. And I'll tell you in a second why it changes everything. First of all, the perception of man, the role of man in the universe, the observable. So now it's not enough for you because it's very misleading. The world appears to be that everything is revolving around us, and in essence, it does not. So it's very, very misleading. So you've got to test. If you have any thoughts, you've got to check and challenge. And if that is up for grabs, anything is up for grabs. And then what you do with scripture. Huge turmoil. And this will create the beginning of new science up to Isaac Newton, which is the end of that time. Now, this is 15th century. Now, in 15th century, people saw Copernicus, and it's interesting because the church, if anybody ever saw the book of, first of all, what's the book of Copernicus? It's called Revolutions. Revolutions. So he thought revolutions, the revolutions of the earth around the sun. But in essence, it's the beginning of a revolution. It's a manifesto of a revolution. But the ones who wrote if you look at the introduction, and what they say in Hebrew, askama, which is approbation, was approved by the church. The church endorsed the book because they didn't realize the implications of that book when the book came out. The book comes out, and people say, you know something, maybe it's not just a gimmick. Maybe this is how it works. How are we going to observe? So there was somebody, and let's go now, we're going to go into the 16th century when Copernicus is being talked about. People thought that Copernicus, it's a cute idea, but it's really not real. The world is still geocentric. And now we're going to see how Prague plays a role and what was the Jewish area in the 16th century. Okay? Now, before that, you realize that this is a world that's being challenged. Copernicus is out there. People don't realize that so many implications of Copernicus. Okay, geocentric, heliocentric, people don't focus on it. Then you have in the 16th century, half of the world was uncovered. This is the discovery of all the new continents. Can you imagine? You live here in Earth and you're happy and very comfortable in Europe. They just come out that there is a whole entire new world, new people. These Indians, meaning Indians who they believed were actually Jews. And these are the 10 tribes of the Jewish people. But that's how the Christians saw. That's the missionaries where they went to Christianize America. So they realized that you live in a world very comfortable, and half of the world you don't even know. So you realize that this is shaking the world at its core. Now it took time at that time. So this is all in the 16th century. Okay? The discovery is 1492, America, 1500 Brazil, etc., etc., etc. So this is percolating out there. And now we're going to move to Prague and to the Magic Kingdom of Prague. Prague was called the Magic Kingdom. So the Magic Kingdom is not Disney World is the new version. The old version is Prague. But you'll see, now you'll be able to put it into context when you see Prague. Okay, let's go see the next one, please. The next, yes. This is Tycho Brahe. Who is Tycho Brahe? Tycho Brahe was the greatest astronomer of that period. He actually built very interesting to know, in Denmark, an observatory called, everybody to know, the Uraniborg. The Uraniborg was actually a city, a palace. At that time, there was no, as I told you, there was no telescope. So how do you measure? So he became very famous in Uraniborg, and he built something which you're going to see called the quadrant. And we're going to see today that they have the quadrant actually displayed. The quadrant was a real measuring scale that you could measure the planets as they moved along. So you could have very clear measurements. And he started with his observatory, was an enterprise. You're going to soon see the observatory. The famous Tycho Brahe, he was the most famous. He was in Denmark, and he was invited by Rudolf II, and they built an actual observatory and a palace for him outside of Prague. And he comes to the city in the 16th century, end of 16th century, okay? His astronomy, now we're going to see how he challenges the whole world. Next. This is Rudolf II. Some people call that he was completely crazy. If everybody saw the pictures, Rudolf II is the most interesting guy. If you go to the web, you'll see that he was a crazy guy. But he was the sponsor. He spent all his money in developing arts and sciences. And he was a mystic. Mystical times. What was mysticism? And why is it called mystical king? The mystical king is that he tries to transcend, to go. The ultimate mysticism at that time was alchemy. Does anybody know what alchemy is all about? Taking lead and transforming it into gold. See, like transformation. Mysticism was magic, was connecting to the supernatural, to something beyond what you see. So he was always searching of how to look something from beyond of what to see. So you look at a guy, Rudolf II, he sees this guy in Uraniborg, the guy in Denmark, Tycho Brahe, who has just found all these beautiful and great observatories. He says, you know something, this is the right guy to bring to Prague, because he might find in the stars who knows what. And this is why he's brought to Prague, Tycho Brahe, by Rudolf II. Rudolf II is the guy who sponsored also and helped, if I'm not mistaken, Paracelsus. Who's Paracelsus? Does anybody know Paracelsus? What's the big thing of Paracelsus? He invented chemistry, right? Chemical reaction, because alchemy is also some kind of chemical reaction. He's the inventor of chemistry. Now, he is the sponsor. You know what was the hobby of that time? Did anybody ever see a closet of curiosities? Yes, you know the closet of curiosities? It's very interesting. At that time, they had, and by the way, you go to any museum, they collected closets and they brought curiosities from all over the world. Because now the Americas are there, so you could bring crazy stones. And all of these oddities, because you wanted to show that the world is what it is, but you could find things which are magical, things that you could change, and things from beyond. So he brought all kinds of interesting oddities. And that was Rudolf II. This was the pastime in this country. In Prague, we found So many of those closets of curiosities. And people actually kept lists, and you invited people and you showed all your curiosities. So that's him, okay? That's the palace that he built for Tyco Brahe to create his observatory outside of Prague, and this is the city of Prague. Now, what's Paracelsus important? I told you yesterday. What is modern science in its core? Number one, testing and observing, which means the reality that you see is not what it is. You've got to test and observe, because the basic thing that you see that the world is geocentric, and it's just not. So it changes the whole perception. So if anybody says anything, you've got to test to make sure that it works. Number one. Number two, you know what it creates is the world of magic. And magic becomes science. That not only you are here to think about the world, but you're actually trying to, by testing the world, you realize that you could manipulate, and you could change things. And this is the beginning of science into changing reality and making actually better. Now, why is Paracelsus the father of that idea? And I told the people before yesterday, when you were sick before, what was Ptolemy, you should always remember, Ptolemy was the astronomy for 1,000 years. Who was medicine for 1,000 years? In all its translations into the Arabic, but what was the book? Can you imagine, for the world kept the same astronomy and the same medicine for 1,000 years. Let's talk about development. That's why it's called the Dark Ages. Today you look back, calls it the Dark Ages, but they didn't think that way. What was the book on that? It's called Galen. Galen wrote an interpretation, the same idea into Hippocrates. And he created his medicine. And that medicine was used for 1,000 years. And the medicine is basically, I'll give you just in a very rough idea, there are four humors. The body has four chemicals. And sickness is when they get out of balance. And to be healthy is to bring back the balance. If you had a cold, that was the typical idea. If you read it, and you always think, when you have a cold, what do Jewish mothers tell you to do? To have chicken soup, hot chicken soup, right? Where did they get the idea from? That's Galen. Galen writes that. Galen says that you have a hot humor, a hot chemical in your body, and you have a cold chemical. A cold means that the cold chemical, it's too strong. So what you do, you take a hot chemical to balance it out. So what you do, you take hot soup. Okay, a hot chemical works, and Jewish mothers accepted Galen from the 3rd century, right? Now the problem, it works on a cold. But if you have an infection and a bacteria, you died. That's why, you know what was the life expectancy of a person at that time? Give me a guess. Today, what's life expectancy? Between 70 and 80 years old. How was life expectancy at that time? Expectancy? 35, 30. Because people died at birth. So many kids died because there was no such a thing as infection. But this is all based on an idea. And it's Aristotelian, this idea. That the world was perfect, and the world is perfect. Man came here to destroy the world and to make the world worse. And therefore, medicine was to try to bring the balance that was originally. In other words, you're going, instead of forward, everybody was going backwards. But that's Aristotelian idea. And you see how Aristotle is the father of that concept. So sciences, observe what's there because there is perfect. You got to understand and you have to philosophize. Medicine is know what the pristine state of man. Medicine is to bring back to that pristine moment. That was Galen medicine. And it fit very well, by the way, by the Christian notion of man. Why? Because Christians believed that the original sin, man was perfect. The original sin brought man down, so man can only destroy. People can only go back to the pristine state through the concept of grace. And therefore, you're always trying to go back to that original state. This is where science was. Paracelsus comes and he says, one second, the world is not perfect. I can use chemistry to create new things. So we can move forward, not backwards. So this is Paracelsus' creation of chemistry. Okay, and this time also. Rudolf II believes in it through the core. He's always trying to find magic to make the world and make it better. So science goes from philosophy into magic. Because science is magic. And this is Rudolf II. That's why he's called the Magic King, the Mystic King, finding the secrets of the universe. And this he sponsors, and everybody who has kinds of ideas, he's the one who helps it. Next. This is, first of all, there was one slide with Tycho Brahe and Kepler, Johann Kepler. Somebody disappeared. Now, this is the quadrant. This is the famous quadrant. You see, and you're going to see, we're going to see this. But look at the quadrant. The quadrant is this roller. And this is how this thing would be. This is Tycho Brahe. These floors were the 3 floors. Uraniborg was 3 floors. It was like a multi-level thing. It was a whole enterprise. And this is how they measured the sky. And they measured it very carefully. Bless you. And you know what they found out? And I'll tell you something very fascinating because we're going to go. What was his finding? He was going to try to prove, bless you, he was trying to prove Copernicus. But you know what he found out? He found out about the comet. You realize that the comet, with this measurement, the comet that he found revolutionized the world. Does anybody know why? Because Aristotle thought that the world, look at how they thought the world lived. They thought that you're here, and the stars and the planets are all fixed into some kind of a wheel, like the fortune wheel. And that wheel revolved around. But the planets and the stars were static because they were supposed to be perfect. Movement, as you know from Aristotle, is the concept of imperfection. So they were static and perfect, and they were perfectly round. The sky, because this is the whole idea, the man, we created problems, so we are imperfect, but the sky is perfect. But the sky was actually, the movement of the stars is only apparent. According to Aristotle, it was a wheel, and the wheel turned. You know what the problem was? The comet, right? Because the comet goes through. So Aristotle always believed that the comet comes below the planets and the stars. It's called sublunar. With this quadrant, he was able to prove, I think it was Comet Halley, that it comes from beyond the planets. So in other words, it's traveling. So he debunked the first idea. Because if there is a solid wheel that holds the planets in place, how the heck did the comet go through the solid wheel and didn't break the wheel? So it must be that's not solid. So the first move that he proved was that the planets and the stars were all moving and floating around like birds. For us, it's very clear, but imagine for somebody who has been taught that the sky is something very cool, it's like some kind of a wheel, and the planets revolve around, and it's all around us, and we see that these things are floating around, and there are comets to go through. This was the first revolution, more than anything else. Okay, remember the first revolution. He also, through the observations of this, he didn't have a telescope, he also thought that the world revolves around the sun and not around the earth. Okay, next one, let's just see for a second, and I'll tell you afterwards. This is his model. You know his model was, he was a very big politician. The truth is he was very rich. And he said this, if I'm going to tell everybody that the world is heliocentric, runs around the sun and not around us, they're going to put me in a loony house. I can't do that. So he said, you know something, the whole world revolves around the sun, but the sun revolves around the earth. So, okay, this is the coolest thing in the world. He resolved, this is called a good compromise. And that's his, anybody wants to see, this is it. You see the earth, this is the sun, all the planets around the sun, and around the earth. So the planets, the whole solar system revolves, and it's all floating, but revolves around us. But this was everybody knew that it was a compromise against Copernicus. Okay, so this is the setting here in Prague. Here comes this person with magic. Just realize that now the whole world is magic. Because you realize that all the planets are like balls floating in the air. There's nothing more magical. So Rudolf II says, I have to bring this guy here. So they bring Tycho Brahe, and he opens. So this is the setting in the non-Jewish world. And in the Jewish world, we had a huge authority who was also magical. We're going to learn about him, because that's our focus. It's called the Maharal. But you know what the beauty of the Maharal is? That he believed in this. The Kabbalists, there were 2 schools of Kabbalah at that time. It's the school of Kabbalah of Tzfat and the school of Kabbalah of here. And the main thrust of Kabbalah was that God created the world in an imperfect state. And we are here to make it perfect. We are partners of God. God didn't create the world and gave us and allow us to destroy it, which is the Christian view of the world. The Kabbalists said, no. God created the world imperfect, and we were created to bring perfection to that. That's why in creation says that God created the world to be made in the future by man. That's why God, when He comes to man and He comes to create us, He tells us what? Let us make man. Everybody knows let us make man. And the question is, who's the us? If God is creating, well, who is getting permission and who is He talking to? So the Sfat Emet, the Kabbalah said God was talking to man himself. Let us make you. It's a partnership. I'll give you the potential, you bring to realization. So this is exactly what created modern science. The world is not perfect. Don't try to bring the world back. Try to move the world forward. We are moving the world, making it better. All the magic is within the powers of man, not only in the powers of man, within the mandate of man. Okay? And that's the moral. This is the Jewish thought that's being breeding at the same time. You notice how God creates the world. It's always those two things go together. Here is Rudolf II, who thinks this about the world. The Jewish thought, we think exactly the same way. They are together. And this is the place where creates a conversation between the two. And this we're going to see. Next page. So, okay, this is just, again, revolutions. Now, we are going to see today, so what's today? Let's tell a little bit about today. Today we are going to see an actual observatory. Now the observatory we're going to see is observatory before the telescope. There's no Hubble telescope, there's nothing. There's always measuring. Now this observatory is in Prague. So it was built by the Jesuits in the 18th century and is a replica of that observatory that was there. So you could see the quadrant and you see all of it what was there. So we're going to see it, and this is part of this complex. It's one of the nicest, very few people know about it in Prague. It's called the Clementinum. It's a Jesuit complex, and it has an observatory. You see how observatory look like without a telescope. Therefore, it's so alien. But the creation of those measuring instruments allowed for the revolution to take place. Next. Now we're going to go into somebody very interesting. They lived in Prague, somebody called Reb David Gans. But David Gans is a historian, and what he did was, the Maharal believed that two things. First of all, when he saw Tycho Brahe coming, Tycho Brahe spoke his language. You know why? Because this idea of the perfect sphere and etc. is Aristotelian, and the Jews never believed. The Talmud said that's not the case. The planets were floating on the air, and that's what we believed. And the Talmud says that when we came to argue with the Greek philosophers, we gave in to them. And the reality of it is, because you'll see in a second why. But we gave in to them. Comes Tycho Brahe, and he says, you know something? You Jews are right. Why did you give in? You are 100% right. There is no such a thing as the sphere. It's all floating in the air, and you guys are right. So Rabbi David Gans, which we're going to see, he was in Prague, and he was a student of the Maharal. He goes ahead and he spends time in the conversation with Tycho Brahe and with Johann Kepler. Tycho Brahe was here only for 1 year, but he has a student, Johann Kepler. Everybody know the Kepler laws? That's Johann Kepler here. So this is the guy, and they spend the time, and they start, and the Jews, with the Maharal, thought that Copernicus was right, even before Tycho Brahe. And the reason is because even though Scripture says the opposite, but he says the Scripture is talking about spiritual essential terms, not physical terms. And the physical terms you have to explore. God gave man the mandate to explore, to make the world better. So the Maharal was the first one who says, this is the way to go. Don't take things for granted. We have to make it better. Appearances and physical realities are misleading. You got to explore. So the Maharal sends Reb David Gans, and Reb David Gans, two things he does. First of all, this is the quadrant. So he wrote a book about that quadrant, and he spent many weeks by the observatory. And he printed, this is the book, this is the original book, if anybody wants to see. This is the original book printed at that time. It was printed later because the church didn't allow, which goes, and he is the first Jewish mention of Copernicus. If you want to see, the book is a couple hundred years old. And you're able to see, everybody's here to see that this is real. And he is the one who goes into two things. First of all, he goes to show that this is Tycho Brahe, and his conversations, you haven't kept, imagine the rabbi with the top scientists of that time, and the Jews were not loved anywhere. And there is a huge conversation and become good friends. And Johann Kepler, he writes a famous story. Johann Kepler comes to he comes to David Gans, or David Gans, and says, you know, your Talmud agrees to the Greeks, but why did they give in? Why did they give in? They should have stick by their guns, and they were right. And that creates, and he spends time in the observatory, and this is one of the few places where the observatory is actually taught and described. Let's see the next page. And just to finalize, look at the difference between the Jews and the Christian opinion, the Jewish opinion. About 70 years ago, there lived a man named Nikos Copernicus. Okay, this we're talking about 70 years before. This is 1570, 1580. Surpassing Copernicus, he said that he was being analytical by anyone since Ptolemy. He ascertained the positions and motion of the planets and the stars with great precision, and to solve the complex problems involved, and above all, in order to discover the true causes of all the things, he asserted, with extraordinary greatness of mind, to demonstrate that the spheres are absolutely immobile, and that there is the terrestrial globe, which is in constant rotation around them. This idea that the earth revolves around the sun. And he devoted his demonstration, so the Jewish opinion was very much for it. 4 years later, you know what happens? The church, because Galileo is the first thing that Galileo does. You know what Galileo, the second debunking of Galileo, what did Galileo create? Besides the laws of motion, the telescope. So he looks at the telescope, the first thing he sees, that the moon has craters. Again, violates everything Aristotle believed. Aristotle believed they were very complete round spheres, perfect. And you see that they're not perfect. So it's imperfection. So he debunks and he says, you know something, if you observe, you actually look at it, you'll see that these things are moving. So what happens to the church? The church realizes that this is going to challenge the entire church. It challenges the concept of grace. It challenges scripture. It challenges the centrality of man. And the first thing they do is put the Galileo in the index. Does anybody know what the index is? The index was the list of prohibited books that you're going to burn. And he was threatened, and the Inquisition brought him in, and he had to recant, and he recanted. He just gave in. He was a politician. He just gave in and said, okay, I'm wrong, and you guys are right. And this is the difference, that the Jewish opinion not only adopted Copernicus, but they went forward and they participated into that. And the Christian view was that they went against it. Very interesting. You know why it's interesting? This year is called the Year of Astronomy. If anybody knows, the UN declared this year of astronomy is dedicated to the invention of astronomy. And the church, I have an article I'm going to show you in German, if anybody knows, the church has just announced they decided to reconcile finally with Galileo Galilei, and they adopted him. He's a son of the Catholic Church, and he's the one who invented modern science, and Copernicus and Galileo has been adopted back to the Christian church, finally. So it's all backwards. So they asked the guy, so they have an interview. Die Welt has an interview with the church. They say, 1 second, you finally, so he says, yes, it was adopted in 1800. I think the 19th century, they accepted finally Galileo into the church. But he says, 1 second, what's going forward? He says, yes, but forward we still have problems because, again, they have not changed. What has changed and created modern science, there's no question about it, is Jewish thought. You know what was the seminal event that led all this movement of Prague into a national worldwide movement? Is the translation of Dari. Darizal is the Kabbalah of Tzfat, which is, I told you, Maral is the Kabbalah of here. They talk in different ways the same language. We're going to go tonight why. And Dari in Tzfat. His Kabbalah was translated into Latin, into a book called Kabbalah Denudata. And Kabbalah Denudata goes into all these ideas. The world is here to be made, to be changed. Reality misleads. We are here to bring something called Tikkun. That book had a seminal effect on everybody. We know that. How do we know that, guys? From the letters of Newton. Newton, Leibniz in science, Locke. And we found all his letters, or how they were all influenced by Kabbalah Denudata. And that Kabbalah Denudata changes everything, and that's the world of Prague. And that's what you guys are going to see. Next, that's it. First of all, there is one with Johann Kepler. I think we missed one slide. I think maybe the first slide. No, it's missing the slide. No, it's not here. On your book, by the way, if you look in your book, you have the picture of Johann Kepler. And by the way, guys, this is the book, if you want to come and see, of that time. It was printed. This is the first idea, and he describes in great detail.
It's not in our book either.
No?
Is this one you learned?
Yes, this is Johann Kepler.
It's one page before the start of the...
Right, this is Johann Kepler, the laws of motion.
39.
This is the beginning, and this are the friends. See, this is Tycho Brahe, and this is Johann Kepler. Johann Kepler is the one who runs the thing. He does the laws of Kepler. The Keplerian laws are the first astronomical laws. And this, by the way, if anybody wants to come and see, is the book. And he has all the drawings, if you see, of the quadrant list. This is a couple hundred years old, but you have all the quadrants. And what you're going to see today at the museum, this is it. You see? This is the quadrant. And he shows you how to measure the planets using the quadrants.
Is that your book?
Yes. I collect it. It's very interesting. This is first mention of Copernicus in the Jewish text and the first religious text ever. It just shows the different attitude. Any questions, anybody? And here, by the way, at the last page, he has a diary of when he spent the time on that observatory. And it was a world of magic. Because imagine, you're seeing that the whole world is moving around you. And everything that looks so comfortable is not that comfortable. It's all magic, and it's all mysticism, and it's all, imagine, planets and everything is floating. The Talmud was proven right 2,000 years later. So you can imagine, this is 2,000, the Talmud was finished in the year 500. This is 1,000 years that the Talmud, they thought, was saying some nonsense. And here it's proven that it was completely right. So imagine the vindication.
All right, can I ask you, I have two questions.
Yes.
Does that quadrant still, does that actually work in modern science? Is it accurate?
It's not accurate enough, but you could see. You could see the planets move a lot. You realize that the planets move all over.
But those measurements, I mean, obviously they didn't have high-tech.
No, it's not how.
Is it fairly accurate considering the fact?
More or less. But the laws are, Kepler laws are used today. Newton is based, everybody knows, you should know that Newton based himself. All the laws of gravity are based on the Kepler laws of motion. If I'm not mistaken, it's all an extension of the third law of motion. So those laws of Kepler that were developed in Prague are the backbone of all modern science. And that's still proven, and those three laws are three laws of science that he came out. Those are laws, immutable, and I told you, Newton, if I'm not mistaken, is the development of the third law of Kepler.
And how does the church resolve the issue today of the imperfection of the world?
It's so interesting. See, Kabbalah, I'll give you just a second. So Kabbalah, there is a guy called Kudert. If anybody wants further reading, there is a book that came out. The book is extremely expensive, but if you don't, I'll give you a copy. I think the author is okay. His dissertation, it's called the guy Kudert, a non-Jewish guy, who says the impact of Kabbalah on Christian thinking. Because Kabbalah made that change. Kabbalah tells you that's natural. And that has such an impact. So the church had the choice of either letting people become Jewish or adopt to the Kabbalah Dedudata. So that book is, I was going to bring, but it's too heavy. They're two very old looking, it's like magical books with pictures and kinds of things. If you see all the magic and you open, that's Kabbalah Dedudata. So it had an impact, they had no choice. So how do they reconcile? It's unclear. So they have in Die Welt, yesterday I was on the plane, and I was like sitting next to a guy, and I read a little bit of German, so I see the guy's reading the newspaper, and it has Galileo on the first page. So I waited until everybody left the plane, I got this newspaper, and this is it. It's an interview with the Vatican. It says, 1 second, guys. So how does this fit with your worldview? And how does that mean to science? In Christian theology, there is always a clash between science and religion. Templeton, you know John Templeton, very wealthy guy. John Templeton, you know what John Templeton does? John Templeton has the John Templeton Prize, which is $1 million a year for people who could move the battle between science and religion forward. Okay, $1 million a year. John Templeton has a prize called the Templeton for Science and Religion, called the Reconciling Science and Religion. Because for Christians, will be always an issue, because science is moving the opposite direction of religion. And they have to constantly reconcile and rewrite. You know, the thing is, for Jews, this is never a problem. Science never battles religion. Science is a form of religious behavior because you are creating perfection to the world, you are understanding the magic and the greatness of the world, and the world is moving forward, not backwards. So therefore, I told John Templeton would be out of business. He would not have to offer $1 million to reconcile because there's no reconciliation. The Maral thought you can only understand God and the Bible if you understand the universe. And that requires work, that requires change, that requires movement forward. This is the whole idea. We are constantly playing, but this the world, we are here to bring the rectification of the world. And that's Kabbalah thought. So the science, the religion was never reconciled to the church. And so it's ongoing battle. It's $1 million a year. Evolution, right? You talk about evolution and religion, they clash. In religious Jewish thought, that's not the case. If you want to go, you could go into religion. That's not the case. It's very Christian. You know why? And I'll tell you for 2 seconds, because the Christians are concording. You know what's concording? They take the Bible, they don't have the oral Torah. They have only the written Torah. So if you read it, the Bible is actually misleading. The Maharal is the one who says that the Bible was also incomplete. You know, look at the theory of the world. The Bible is also incomplete and therefore is misleading. And you need human creativity in the oral traditions to bring perfection to the Bible. So the same world, the world needs perfection, the Bible needs perfection. So the fact that the Bible tells you that the sun revolves around the earth is because it's imperfect. You have to bring interpretation. You have to draw meaning out of it. So that's the kind of thing. The church will never believe that. So the church is an ongoing battle. It's an ad hoc hypothesis every time. So this is what they interviewed this guy. If you read German, if you want, I'll read it more and translate, because it's very interesting. They ask, because the Vatican is finally, 500 years later, not 500, like 400 years later, is releasing the documents of the, It's releasing the documents of the trial of the Inquisition. This is being released because it's the year of astronomy. It is 400 years. And it's just fascinating. So the idea is, okay, so they ask, so what's going on? It says, okay, we resolved the issue of Galileo, but the battle will continue. That's basically the idea. So the battle continues. Yes?
So the Maharal, at this period of time, like it happens to be that this was the age of modern science, so it worked
Right.
out really well. But was he the only one who was teaching this at that time? Or was it just in Prague, but anywhere else in the world? Was this?
I'll tell you who I think. Okay, I'm going to tell you because things don't happen in isolation. We believe that there is such a thing called zeitgeist. At least I think that there is such a thing as zeitgeist in Judaism. You know zeitgeist? Zeitgeist is called the spirit of the times. God sends things that float in the air, and everybody thinks the same way. And we are using this to bring spirituality to the world. So things happen at the same time. There were 3 seminal people in different places in the world in the same endeavor. Here, the Maharal. In Poland, there was somebody called the Ramo. He lived very shortly, but he did also revolution in thought, in history, and he did a lot of it in the sciences. And he's the one who talks about the development of Galen and Hippocrates, and in Sfat, the school of Sfat of Dari, of the Kabbalah, which Kabbalah the Nudata, which become that word of Kabbalah is translated into Latin, and that becomes a revolution, becomes an uncontrollable revolution. It becomes once the Ari in Sfat, but it's Sfat in Israel, the mystical school there, the mystical school here, and the school in Krakow. Those are the 3 places of the world. Now, is there in the Arab countries? The Arab countries also were there, but the Arabs were much more tolerant at that time. Okay, let's look at the world at that time. The Arabs are much more tolerant. So the Arabs did appreciate science, innovation, and creativity. So the Jews were much more in sync. But what stuck out like a sore thumb were the Jews in the Christian lands. But it's true. So the Jews all over were thinking about the same. But the Maharal becomes, you see tonight, a magical figure. Because here's this figure, the Rudolph II, goes after him. And legends start building because it's all magical. And here is somebody who was the master of that. But he's the one, the Maharal is the one that says the Bible is incomplete. So he goes, that's what he says, the Bible is incomplete. He says it's the analogy of bread. He says the Midrash says God created, in the beginning, bread came out of trees. But today, you have wheat and you have to make it bread. You can't eat wheat. So the Bible is also not digestible unless you bring the oral tradition and you interpret. So the Bible is actually misleading. So it says what? The earth says, it says things that make no sense. Okay, welcome. This is not the only thing. The Bible is a cryptic book. It's not an open book. So the old schools at the same time are revolving on the same, and they have a humongous impact into Christian thinking, uncontrollable thinking. And the church had no choice. The Coder says once Kabbalah the Nudata becomes translated into Latin, the cat is out of the box. You can't take scripture on the face value. So you know something very funny, and that's the Christian's main problem. The Christians say like this: if you take a Bible, let's say you go to the store and you buy a Bible, the Holy Bible, and you decide, okay, I want to become a religious Jew, I'm going to follow the Bible. I'm a biblical Jew. You'll be completely not Jewish. If you follow the Bible in its literal sense, you'll be not Jewish. You look like a half Christian that decided to keep like who knows what, like an old age Christian, because our Bible, our conception of the Bible is very different than Christian. Our Bible is cryptic, is written in gaps, is misleading for us to be the partners. We are partners in creation, we are partners in the Bible. We are making it better, we are making it better. That's the beauty of it. The world of the Bible, the tradition that was given at Sinai oral is our interpretation, it's our activities, our partnership. And that changes the world. Science is like that today. So therefore, whenever you hear somebody that's trying to reconcile science and religion according to the Jewish law, you know that that's a oxymoron, right? Because there's no reconciliation. Science and religion are two expressions of the same truth. They're not reconcilable contradictions. Contradictions only Christian dogma, because Christian dogma at its core violates science. You could find ad hoc hypotheses, but they don't work going forward. So it constantly is a struggle and battle. In the Jewish, there's no such a thing. Yes?
Does the Talmud discuss the shape of the earth? Or?
Yeah, the shape of the earth is already discussed even before the Talmud, according to tradition, according to the Zohar. That the world, the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, which is precedes the Babylonian Talmud at least by 200-300 years, says that the world and all celestial, celestial beings are all round. The Talmud says something very amazing, the Jerusalem Talmud. It says that all creation by God is circular and round. All human creation is square. And I will explain to you why, but it's fascinating. Okay, not only the earth, but the earth and every single being is circular and round. And there's nothing that's created by God that is square. That's why the mitzvot, you read the precepts, our commandments, there is never a round commandment. Only one thing is round, which is not a mitzvah, but there's one thing is round. Anybody guess what's the only round thing that we use, and you see the dynamics of it. What is the only round mitzvah? There's no such thing as round mitzvah. Humans are square. Not that we're square, but humans are supposed to have a square world, right? Which there's only one mitzvah. Tefillin has to be square, the tzitzit has to be square. You tell me. It's all square. Because human actions represent the square. Now, there's one mitzvah which people have the custom to do it round. Only one mitzvah. The matzah. Excellent. Excellent. Because it's God that reminds us of God's intervention when we were nothing. So in other words, that's an excellent point. We didn't do it. God came to us when you were in Egypt, and he took us out without dessert, without us deserving. That's why it's round. But what matzah is square? Machine matzah. No machine matzah. Because that represents human intervention, the creation of machine progress. Square matzah. So you realize the interplay between the hand matzah, which is the matzah that they ate in Egypt, and the modern day matzah, which is square. And according to us, fits very well. And I'll just finalize something very fascinating. Did anybody ever think the pi? Pi is what's called a transcending number, right? If you take the diameter of the circle by its diameter, no matter what size the circle is, or size of the diameter, it's pi. It's a transcending number. Does anybody know what is a transcending number? Why is it called a transcending number? Why is pi? Because you cannot even create a polynomial approximation. You can approximate. In other words, they have computers who have been running for years. They have 100 million digits behind the 3, and there's no pattern. And you can't even approximate. That's why it's transcending. This and the E are transcending. Meaning
transcending human thought?
Human thought, human perception. It's not capturable. And you could have computers have been working to try to find a pattern, right? Maybe after 100 million digits, there's some kind of a pattern that you can't, there's no pattern. Why? Why the world is so funny? It's in such a way. But you know why, according to Jewish thought? Because this circle represents this idea that created by God. Because the circle has no beginning and no end. It's infinite, and the point of origin is the point of destination. You start where you end at. It doesn't matter what you do, you can't escape.
Isn't it more of a helix? Because you're going around, but you're not coming back
to, again,
But
we
the
want
s-
to increase and get better.
I will show you in a second, but the circle doesn't get better. The circle goes back to where it started. That's a circular. The line, which is the square, defines directions. That's why it represents human action, human intervention. One is human creativity and freedom of choice. The other one is determination and God. Those two realities are incompatible and they cannot be reconciled. That's why that's a transcending number. How does human creativity intervention with God's determination and perfection? That's Maimonides' question, number one. If God knows the future, how can you have a choice? And Maimonides says it's irreconcilable because there are two different dimensions. That's why the circle and the line are irreconcilable. That represents that reality. They're reconcilable. And you know how time is viewed in Jewish thought? That's what you just said. It's a spiral. It's a circle that moves forward. So it's a line. So you always walk in eggshells, right? It's God intervention and God does everything, but you're moving it forward, which is a spiral. That's why time conception in Jewish lore is not a circle. It's not a square and a straight line. It is a spiral. Very important to know. Which means that if you follow the markets, you realize that past performance is a good guide for the future. But you realize it will never be exactly the same because it's not a circle, but it's the same in a different clothing, right? Which is called a spiral. That's very, very important. So if you want to know what's going to happen in the future, look at the past and realize that the world is moving forward. So you take the past and move it forward, and that's our creativity. Tradition and innovation. Jewish life, it's the build between the circle and the square. What's the circle? Tradition. You can't get out of it. And innovation that you're moving it forward. That juggling is the juggle of human life. Tradition and innovation, which is the circle of time moving forward in space. In essence, they are almost irreconcilable. That's why it's a pie. But that's life. You guys, that's exactly the Maharal. He says, okay, this is human innovation. We are moving forward. It's teleology, but we are bound by tradition. And that interplay is the greatness of human life. And that's time, that is science, and that's religion, and that's the Torah. Yes? So that's it. So you're going to see today, so what we're going to see today? Today we're going to see that world. We're going to go in the morning, we're going to see the Jewish quarter, because you realize that Christians, that's why Christian dogma hates Judaism. And they have to, because this violates everything they believe. So here in Prague is an example of that. Because Hitler, in he wanted to create a museum of the extinct race. So we're going to see everything that went on from the 16th century Prague he never destroyed because he wanted to show that Christianity won over. He believed he was the Holy Roman Emperor. And he was coming to destroy the pestilence of the world. So you'll see here the Jewish world in the morning. And then in the afternoon, you're going to see to the Jesuits. Because the Jesuits are Christians. We are very believers of science. And they were always the outcasts, the Jesuits. So the Jesuits actually replicated this observatory in 18th century Prague. And you'll be able to see the quadrant. You'll be able to see the writings of Kepler, the writings of Tycho Brache. They are the founders of modern science. We're going to see firsthand that you're going to see how an observatory looks like. That you go on the second floor and open space. And you see it's in the old city of Prague. Today, with all the skyscrapers, you can't see anything. But at that time, the city was very low. And you see how they measured the planets. And you see, and you could imagine a rabbi who actually took his time to develop a relationship. This whole book is the relationship, the conversations that they had, and the actual experience that he spent on that observatory looking and doing it. Yes?
So there are some times in Jewish, it's customary in Jewish life to position yourself in a circle. Like, for example, like the old Jews, like the Maharal, the people would be in the center, the people would sit around.
It's a great, yes.
Circus, the Hakafas were circular, so why do we do that?
This is something, it's a great question, and it's excellent. Eli just asked a great question because I wanted to position you for that question. Because you're going to see this is the scientific world. We're going to see, and the interaction with that. Now we're going to see the show, and the show of the Maharal, and Eli already pointed out, but if you see, there is a blatant difference between our shows and the show of the Maharal. Is that idea? Because our shows are facing forward. Right? In other words, it's like it's a movie style, it's like a movie theater. The Maharal shul is not like that. It's like the Sfaradim, which is circular. And so you sit around the beamer. Why? I want you guys to think. We just spoke about the circle. We just spoke about creativity. Why is it in such a way? And this is what you're going to see. Because you'll see that show is very mystical. There is something very magic. And tonight we're going to learn about the show. This is Alt Neu. Guys, read the words. What does Alt Neu means in the simple translation in German? What does Alt mean? What does Neu mean?
No.
This is the Old New show. Now, why is it called Old New? There are millions of explanations. According to what we just said today, I hope you have an idea, because this is what religion is all about. Is that tradition and innovation, the old and the new, negotiating and conversing together. And the Maharal represents that idea. So that's why his show is called Alt Neu. I'll tell you afterwards the different explanations why it's called Alt Neu, because nobody knows, because this show has been up for like 700 years, at least 700 years. It's the oldest show, functioning show in the world. We're going to see the significance of it, but we're going to explore. We're going to see that, and you see how does people come up? Who is the only one who created? You know Frankenstein, right? Probably heard of Frankenstein, right? Where did Mary Shelley get her idea from? It's from the golem, from this robot that the Maharal created, because he represents this old new, this creativity, this magic. So the natural thing is to create a golem, right? In other words, why not to create a robot that will do your lores? And we're going to explore tonight, and we'll see where is it in the show. But the name of the show represents this idea, Rabbi. This is what Judaism is all about. This is the school of Prague, represents the old new. This balance between the two. And the show is called Old New. There are many other explanations, but no question that the translation is Alt Neue. In German is Alte Neue with a E at the end, which means Old and New. Tradition and innovation. But the show, you're going to see, one of the blatant aspects of the show is circular. It's all built in a circular format, and we are going to have to see why. Yes?
You've used the term magic and mystical a couple times. Can you define it in the context that you're in?
Okay, that's a good point, because I was trying. Let me just tell you, what does magical mean at that time? Again, we have to bring in context. Text and context. I always when the Rising Neighbor always said, if you read a text without context, it's a pretext. So if you want to know what magic means at that time, magic was, the idea is that you have the natural world, the set of rules, the very organized world, and you want to break the rules of what you believe is natural. In other words, you just want to transcend reality. Magic is science, right? You make it better, you're changing the status quo. That was magic at that time. Mysticism was at that time the same. I'm trying to reason why I'm saying is this, because the Maharal, this is what mysticism meant at that time. Because you realize William James will change the definition of mysticism, because the mystical definition will change. Today, if you read William James, you'll see something different. But at that time, mysticism meant that there is the world with status quo, the world that everything is comfy, to the world that you know something, it's secret, it's occult, it's out there to be found. So you have to discover. So the discovery, imagine, guys, I want you to position it because you have to feel like it. Imagine you live in a country and you just realize that there is a whole bunch of land out there with people who are completely different, who you never heard of, who are Indians, with all these magical gems that they have there, this chanting. You just look at the sky and you thought that this was very nice, like some kind of a sphere, and you realize this is all floating in the air. And you just realize that you could do with chemistry, change and create new things. It's the magic, is the exploration, what transcending your natural reality to a reality beyond, the world of beyond. That's magic. That's mysticism at that time. As the world evolved, mysticism, the type evolved. But this is the Maharal's Torah. This is the Ari, the idea of that. And this is it. But this is the time, and that's what we're going to see, how this whole thing represents that. And we'll soon see that the challenge is, how does that fit into the circle? So the show is circular. You'll see this, and tonight we're going to explore. We're going to learn there's so many magical stories, and we're going to see the actual book. So if anybody wants to see, this is the actual print, and the first time the Copernicus is mentioned in the religious text. Thank you very much, guys. Hope you enjoy.